Other than your own books, what books have influenced you most, have affected you most in your life?
That's hard for me to answer because I don't always remember the books that I read so long ago, but definitely there's a book called The Greatest Game Ever Played that's about the 1913 U.S. Open when a young caddy from Brookline, Massachusetts won the U.S. Open playing against the greatest golfers of his day. And that's just a phenomenal book, and I love golf, so I love that book. But I'm trying to think of other books. The Lord of the Rings, certainly, when I was, I read those when I was a freshman in high school, and I would read them till 3 in the morning till my mother, would yell like, "Shut your light out," but I couldn't stop reading them, because that just took me to a whole different place. Also, I would say that when I was a young boy, I was a newspaper delivery boy, and I would actually read the Boston Globe as I walked around, and there was a columnist named George Fraser, who was just an incredible columnist, and I still remember walking around reading his columns. I used to love newspapers. And also music, I put out 2 CDs, which is another kind of writing. And they're all linked together to me, but so I would say some of the songwriters like Bruce Springsteen, the Beatles, so many others had a great effect on me. And the older I get, the more I read very little fiction. I read a lot of nonfiction, and there was a Ponca Indian chief named Standing Bear, whose story, I read a couple different books. One was by a man named Stephen Dando, and his story was so compelling that when I did my own Massachusetts Troublemakers books, I ended up doing a story about a woman from Amherst who helped Standing Bear. Her name was Helen Hunt Jackson, and I was so blown away by Standing Bear's story that I wanted to tell his story in my book. But he wasn't from Massachusetts, so I had to figure out a way to get him in there, so that's what I did.
Okay, yeah, I'm also very interested in Lord of the Rings, so I have the same situation reading that book until late.
Oh, yeah.
And then my parents getting angry.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it happens to most of the readers of that book.
Yeah. And even now, like teaching, I find that I still, even though some I teach 7th grade, but some books, we just read a book called Kavik, the Wolf Dog, K-A-V-I-K, and I had never heard of it before, but it's just and it's a short novel. It's just a great book. And the kids loved it, and I loved it. A lot of times, I was actually friends with Robert Cormier, the great young adult fiction writer, and I still remember reading his books, even when I was an adult, because I didn't read them until I got to know him, and they're just great books. They don't have to be even something written aimed at a teenager can still be a great book, I think. And The Lord of the Rings is obviously a fantasy, but it's great books and great movies too.
Okay, is there any writer that you consider as a mentor, or yeah?
Well, Robert Cormier was a great influence on me. He was from Leominster. He died about 6 years ago, or maybe even a little more than that. But he wrote mostly young adult fiction, like I said. But he was. I still remember saying to him one time, at this time he was about 60 years old, and I said, how can a guy who's 60 years old write for kids who are 16? And he said, the one rule that I always follow is that everybody wants to be asked to dance, and when you're not, it hurts. He says a broken heart is a broken heart, no matter how old you are. And that emotional honesty is, I think, one thing that if I hit that, I know that I did something right, and I know that it's going to connect with the reader. I could always tell if I wrote a good column. I could always, I mean, if I thought it was a good column, and I gave it to my mother, and she cried, or I gave it to my friend Walter Crock and he laughed, I knew that it was what I wanted.
Is there any book that you are reading currently from any other author?
I am. I'm reading, actually, there's a trilogy called Horace's, I think it's just called Horace's Trilogy, and it's by an educator who just died named Ted Sizer, who was basically the man who started the charter school movement. And it's Horace's Compromise is the first one, which is just a great book, and it's saying what's really wrong with high schools in America. And he wrote it back in the, I think he wrote it back in the late 70s or early 80s. And a lot of it's true today. And then the next one is Horace's Hopes and Horace's Schools. And they're just very insightful books. Again, you know, I read mostly nonfiction for pleasure. You know, with school I have to read all the books the kids are reading too. We just read a great book called Chinese Cinderella, which is the kids all had to read it, so of course I read it with them, and that was really a great book about a girl growing up as an unwanted daughter in China in the 1950s. And so, again, you know, even if books are aimed toward kids, if they're emotionally honest and they make me think, that's what I'm looking for. I actually read Stephen Ambrose's, what was the title? Something Courage. I can't remember the title, but it's about Lewis and Clark. It's something Courage, like Unencumbered Courage, but that's not the name of it. But it's a really long book, and if I read books at night, I tend to read like 3 pages and fall asleep. So it took me longer to read that book than it took Lewis and Clark to go from Missouri to Oregon and back again.